Totalitarianism is the encompassing of all things under the regulation of a monolithic state. Everything is absorbed into it, and nothing can exist outside of it. Society, culture, religion, and politics are collapsed into a single entity which takes total control of all aspects of life.
So to start off with, we want to look at the characteristics of a totalitarian dictatorship. First of all, you're going to have a dynamic leader. This is someone that people are going to look to kind of rally behind. Secondly, they're going to establish one-party rule inside their country. In other words, they're going to outlaw all other parties once their party comes to power. Thirdly, you're going to have the ideology of submission to the state. In other words, everything should be completely about the state itself, not about the individual. And every decision people make should be towards making the state better. Number 4, the regime will seek to control all aspects of individuals' lives completely. Number 5, they're going to try to control all aspects of society, so the society revolves around the party and the state and politics. Number 6, they're going to use very sophisticated methods of enforcement, including secret police of some sort and military force. And finally, they're going to use technology to solidify their control, especially new technologies of radio.
Ironically, Plato's Republic gives us the first hints of what a totalitarian society might look like. He calls it a republic, but is focused on the dangers of private property and family ties, the preeminence of the common good of the city-state, and the control of the mass culture by the body politic. These are some of the hallmarks of totalitarianism. Machiavelli adds to the philosophy by showing how a ruler can utilize the inherent power of the state for his or her own purposes, especially by means of propaganda, repression, and connivery. Totalitarianism could not be fully realized until more recent times. Though Plato lays the foundation millennia ago, we don't really see it until the 20th century, and though a few examples currently remain, the overall effect of totalitarianism upon the population is usually so destructive that it collapses upon itself within a couple of generations. This event in 1929 gradually turned into a wide-ranging disaster. In that year, the U.S. stock market crashed. What came after is known as the Great Depression, and today we're going to talk about how that impacted Europe and how it coincided with the rise of dictators. The market crash came after several years of U.S. citizens enthusiastically playing the market with borrowed money, and commentators had fueled the rise in stock prices by saying that the stock market was on a permanently high plateau, implying that prices could never fall, so borrowing money to buy stocks was a sure thing. Having made a ton of money while Europeans were bankrupting themselves in World War I, the United States had become a huge source of loans for financing post-war recovery in Europe and elsewhere, as well as agricultural and industrial modernization and the creation of new businesses. But as the stock market dropped, bankers began demanding payment for loans that had been used to buy stocks or invest in major projects, including international ones, and in many cases, those loans could not be paid back, which caused banks to fail. Businesses also failed as consumers had less money to make purchases and workers lost jobs by the millions. When the economy is working, its virtuous cycles seem endless, and when the economy stops working, its vicious cycles also seem endless. And by 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed. That was 1/3 of the total workforce. In terms of keeping their jobs, women were actually sometimes better off than men, but only because they received drastically lower wages, and so single women at least were less likely to be laid off. It was men who came to epitomize the unemployed. Adolf Hitler, like Benito Mussolini, said he wanted to restore not just the reputation of his country, but the war-shattered masculinity of the individual man. Hard times further undermined that sense of strong and secure manhood, but stormtroopers felt they were reviving German masculinity by marching through neighborhoods and beating up communists and Jewish people. Their violence also discredited the democratically run Weimar Republic, which couldn't keep order, and Nazis did employ men via this paramilitary organization, the kind of jobs that the Weimar Republic seemed unable to create. Of course, this is ultimately an example of only solving problems that you yourself have created a long-standing tradition in authoritarian regimes. And it's important to note that Hitler also attracted many admirers from outside of Germany, such as industrialist Henry Ford and aviator Charles Lindbergh in the United States. In the fall of 1932, elections in Germany saw the communists and the Nazis receive similarly strong support, although the Nazis actually lost a few seats in that election. But afterwards, conservative leaders persuaded President Hindenburg, for whom, incidentally, history's most disastrous airship was named, to appoint Hitler chancellor. The theory was that Hitler would be easier to control than the communists, but with the backing of his passionate supporters, Hitler began to dismantle Germany's democratic system, which at that point had really only existed for a bit more than a decade. Through intimidation and brutal treatment of elected representatives, Hitler soon passed an enabling act that allowed him virtually unchecked power. I mean, rarely has an act been more aptly named than the Enabling Act. He then moved in many directions in order to create a people's community, or Volksgemeinschaft. He had a protection squad created, the SS, that rounded up dissenters or anyone not seen as meeting Nazis' standards of proper Germanness. Ways of not being properly German included being Jewish, being gay, being a communist, or being of Roma ancestry, among many others. The SS had vast powers to imprison so-called enemies in concentration camps, or to execute them. In the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, Hitler's forces massacred hundreds of Nazis who had called for a restoration of Nazi purity by ending alliances with businessmen and the military elite. That massacre purged the so-called socialist or anti-elitist element in the original party in order to emphasize German nationalism alone. Nazis held massive book burnings, Nazi youth groups built loyalty from an early age, and it became common for young Nazis to turn in anyone who uttered criticism of the regime, including their own parents and other relatives. Alongside arrests and purges, Nazi policy turned to deficit financing to build infrastructure, such as modern highways that would put men back to work. By 1936, fewer than 1.6 million men were still unemployed. Hitler justified these deficits by saying he would pay for them via future conquests. The Nazis were also concerned with reversing population decline, so they instituted loans for couples giving birth to babies that were deemed pure Aryans, with the wife agreeing to surrender her employment as part of the deal. Birth control and abortion were forbidden to women deemed to be Aryan, but they were readily available to those who the Nazis considered inferior. And then, in the 1930s, foreshadowing broader policies, the government began to murder physically or mentally disabled people in mobile gas chambers that traveled to hospitals and other institutions. The aim was the creation of a master race purged of purportedly inferior types, such as Roma, Slavs, and above all, Jewish people, whose supposed inferiority, in Hitler's word, was documented by the greatest of scientific knowledge. We've talked before about negative integration and positive integration techniques for building a community. Positive integration techniques involve celebrating shared values and finding a definition for what we are. Negative integration techniques involve defining a community by what we aren't, especially by finding enemies or targeting outsiders to unify a community. In Hitler's Germany, the population coalesced into a Volksgemeinschaft by a shared dehumanization and shared hatred of outsiders, especially Jewish people. German feelings of worth and even superiority were restored and strengthened by hating others. And people first suffered what historians call a social death, as their lives were degraded by the Nazis, making any harm that might come to them appear natural. Indeed, so-called social death often precedes widespread murder.
So when the Great Depression hit Germany, it really provided an opportunity for Adolf Hitler here to take control. He attacked the Treaty of Versailles and the territory lost there. He attacked the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. He attacked communists. He attacked Jews. Blamed everybody for Germany's defeat. And so his party, the Nazis, began to really gain traction. And they got more and more power, votes, and seats in the German parliament, the Reichstag. So in light of the Nazi popularity, President Hindenburg of the Weimar Republic appointed Hitler chancellor of Germany in January of 1933. And he kind of felt like if he kept him close, he could control him. But in February of 1933, the Reichstag burned down.
And Hitler blamed the communists for setting the fire and really stirred up terror within the country. People were scared. And when people are scared, they look for easy solutions. And Hitler provided them. And he said basically to the people, you have a national emergency. I'm taking dictatorial power as provided by the Constitution. He took it over and he held it until President Hindenburg died in August of 1934. But this is where the Nazi state that we all have heard of has begun. In 1934, Hitler held a plebiscite, basically let the people decide to rubber stamp his dictatorship. They did it. 85% voted for him. The office of president was abolished. Hitler was dictator. The Third Reich had begun, and it was all done legally, through the system, by the Constitution, and supported by the majority of the German people. Well, Hitler started to consolidate power by eliminating unemployment through government spending programs and becomes an absolute propaganda machine, controlling the press and the radio, having mass meetings to excite crowds, and constantly repeating the message that the Nazi Party provides solutions for Germany. In fact, they even replaced the Weimar flag with the Nazi Party flag. And it's all settled around the idea of complete devotion to not Germany, but the Führer himself, Adolf Hitler. So by now, the Nazis have complete control. Secret police, the SS, are able to carry out the Nazi regime, but in 1934, Hitler undergoes a purge of the Nazi Party, getting rid of all of the disloyal parts of this, especially the brown shirts who had initially brought him to power, using this new part of the SS called the Gestapo. He also makes an agreement with the church. If this sounds familiar with the Lateran Accords from Mussolini, it should. And the agreement was this. The German state would allow the Catholic Church to continue to exist if the Catholic Church turned a blind eye to a new thing called anti-Semitism. Now, this is probably not a surprise to you. The big belief of Nazi Germany was in a pure Aryan race. Now, this was made into law in 1935 by the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws went through and classified Germans and Jews and exactly what that meant. How far back you had to go to have Jewish ancestry in order to be Jewish. By 1938, we end up at an event called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in which Jewish businesses were destroyed, many Jews were beaten, murdered, synagogues were burned, lots of Jews were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. And it was all caused by a minor incident with a minor official and a Jewish boy who was just upset. But it was the excuse for a much larger campaign. In this Jewish state, the Nazi woman was dedicated to love, marriage, and the family. She was something to be admired and protected. She was something that every German man would fight and die for. Okay, so now that they've established that regime, you can see kind of what's going to be coming here. I mean, World War II is not a secret, right? Hitler in Germany. Now it's time to take a look at a little bit different regime, Stalin's Russia. So in Russia, with the Civil War over, the communists start to pay attention to what's going on in the country. And the problem was really economics with a communist system. And so in 1921, Lenin introduces the thing called a new economic policy. Like, he was a flexible guy. He kind of saw, hey, here's the problem. And so it kind of slowed down communist advance here. What he said is that while the government's going to sort of hold on to the big industries here, peasants can own some land, companies can run their businesses, and in fact, he even looks to outside, to capitalists, to kind of help set all this stuff up. He cuts back on terrorism and censorship, and the economy begins to recover. But in 1924, he died of a stroke. So with the loss of Lenin, we have a power struggle between two guys, Stalin and Trotsky. And Stalin is really the one who wins this whole thing. He wanted socialism in Russia. Trotsky wanted international socialism. So Stalin defeats Trotsky, takes control, sends Trotsky out on exile, and ends up getting him killed. In order to consolidate Russia, he creates a series of 5-year plans. The idea is he wanted to advance Russia industrially by setting some solid goals.
Soviet Union, youth were flocking to Joseph Stalin as they did in Germany to Hitler. By 1929, Stalin had consolidated his power in part by bringing thousands of new people to serve in the post-Lenin government at the local, regional, and national level. But the Soviets had big problems, beginning with food scarcity, even though it contained huge amounts of fertile land. Stalin put the blame on kulaks, or well-to-do peasants, which was an extension of Lenin's demonization of kulaks. Lenin once ordered, "Hang, absolutely hang, in full view of the people, no fewer than 100 known kulaks." Lenin ordered many such killings, actually, and believed ongoing violence was essential to revolution, a practice that Stalin dramatically expanded. So in Russian, kulak means fist, and for communists, the property-owning kulaks held communism in their greedy grip by hiding surplus crops from the government. So Stalin roused Soviet youth to a war on kulaks, calling them enemies wedded to individualism and personal wealth. However, as with Nazism, neighbors often denounced anyone whose property they coveted. In Germany, Hitler built unity among his followers by pointing to the false worldwide Jewish conspiracy that supposedly had one goal: the annihilation of the Aryan race. And likewise, Stalin continued the Bolshevik trend of slaughtering supposed enemies of the people, in this case, the, quote, bloodsuckers, cattle, swine, loathsome, repulsive kulaks. They had no souls. They stank, as one Soviet citizen recalled in his memoirs. In both cases, the dehumanization of the other was profound. I mean, you can see it in that quote, actually, as people are not called people, but cattle and swine without souls. But Stalin's goal was not only to fortify communism through the murder of enemies, he also wanted to reorganize the agricultural economy by seizing individual farms and converting them into collective farms that would replace private ownership. And Ukraine was one of the major agricultural regions of the USSR, which made Ukrainians especially vulnerable to the widespread violence of the Stalin regime. Rebelling against the murder and oppression of their friends and neighbors, individual farmers sometimes even slaughtered livestock and destroyed crops. But the execution and persecution of kulaks, friends of kulaks, and anyone else against whom there were grudges did nothing to increase agricultural productivity. In fact, the communalization of farms lowered yields and caused a famine. In total, Stalin's purges and the resulting famine likely resulted in at least 10 million deaths by the mid-1930s. And then Stalin turned to other elements in the population to purge. As famine unfolded, communist leaders needed to find more enemies to blame for it, this time Bolsheviks themselves, both high and low, as well as the military, many of whom confessed in their show trials after having been tortured for days. Some faithful friends of Stalin even admitted to having disloyal thoughts, if not deeds, which was adequate sin to justify execution. On the eve of his death, one old Bolshevik thanked Stalin for devising, quote, the great and bold political idea behind the general purge, which speaks to how deeply propaganda can work on humans. He had entire cities built around new factories and mining operations. For instance, with the assistance of US and German consultants, the city of Magnitogorsk became the center of Soviet steel production. The government summoned workers, both men and women, from across the vast Soviet lands to work there and in other factories. The living conditions were often terrible, the working conditions difficult or even lethal, yet as one woman lathe operator explained proudly, we mastered this new profession, completely new to us, with great pleasure. And to many, both inside the USSR and outside of it, this was a utopia in the making. Idealists from all over the world flocked to what promised to be a wonderland of egalitarian achievement.
Now, he thought that with force and terror, anything could be done. And one of the ideas here was to collectivize farms. He would take all of the excess labor and move it to the cities. And the people out on the farms would then work the farms collectively. Lots of people were opposed to this. and lots of people died because of it. And because the food was being moved into the cities where it was needed for industrial production, it was not being given to the peasants who were working the farms, and millions died of starvation. Finally, between 1934 and 1938, he undergoes a series of purges. Basically, he eliminates, kills anyone accused of crimes against the state. Concentration camps, deaths. Basically, he takes everyone who's possibly opposed to him and eliminates the problems before they can start. There will be no competition. He's in charge. He's the guy. And he finally establishes a communist society in what will become known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. And that's established under Stalin. It's probably the most successful of the totalitarian states because there's absolutely no limit to how much he can control the lives of his citizens. The Communist Party is the only party. It dominates everything, and Stalin dominated the party. Everything is done by the party lines, and everything is followed. He has a secret police. He commands the economy. He focuses on the military. But in a communist system, those people who are in charge get more privileges, benefits, and goods than everybody else. All right, so now that we've looked at these totalitarian regimes, there's a couple things I want to point out. Number one, if you look at this, it's a continuation of tradition in Europe. The countries they arose in, Italy, Germany, and Russia, have strong histories of monarchy in one form or another. Italy is a little weaker than the other two. But certainly, the Hohenzollern dynasty in Prussia and the Romanov dynasty in Russia, they have a history of strong absolute monarchs who used a lot of the same tactics that these totalitarian dictators use. The major difference is this. Totalitarianism had technology on its side, a technology that could provide propaganda to the people and could make these individuals look more like one of the people and make them more appealing to the people. But it's all, of course, going to lead to something which is absolutely tragic.